Welcome to our latest explainer. So, the global economy has rules, right? But as our sources today reveal, we're definitely not all playing by the same ones. We're going to dive right into the staggering reality behind the international financial system, and trust me, we're looking at the stuff they definitely don't put in the official brochures.
Just think about this for a second. Nearly half of humanity is trapped in a system where paying off debt completely eclipses basic human needs. We're talking about 3.4 billion people living in countries that are forced to spend more on debt interest than on schools or hospitals. I mean, if a system produces that kind of result for literally half the globe, we've got to stop and ask, who exactly designed this thing?
Which brings us to Section 1. Who built the table? The origin of global economic rules.
To understand how this inequality is literally built into the architecture, we first have to track how a very small, incredibly homogeneous group of powerful nations set up the foundational agreements. Going back to 1947, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade kicked off with just 23 members. Then NATO in 1949 had 12, and the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, exactly 6. Basically, a tiny, exclusive club of rich nations, all perfectly aligned in their own interests, built the entire framework of global trade before anyone else could even pull up a chair.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how this club aggressively expanded its membership later on. They started inviting poorer nations, but only after the crucial, load-bearing rules were already locked firmly into place. The club kept growing into the massive numbers we see today, but those foundational rules, they stayed exactly the same. Developing nations were basically invited to join a game that was already well underway.
Our sources argue that this setup creates a trap known as consent tailoring. Developing nations are essentially handed a pre-written menu and told, sign this or be left out in the cold entirely. It's kind of like being invited to a dinner party where you're forced to split the bill, but the host ordered all the expensive food before you even walk through the door. Because really, consent without genuine alternatives isn't actually consent at all.
Moving on to Section 2, the sovereign debt trap, the inescapable spiral.
This brings us to the first major mechanism of structural disadvantage, the international borrowing market, and the absolute crushing weight of compound debt. The sources highlight that poor countries are charged 2 to 4 times more for the exact same financial lifeline. When the United States borrows money, it pays around 2% interest. But when a developing nation borrows to, say, build a hospital, they pay 6 to 8%. It's literally the exact same loan, just with an entirely different, heavily inflated price tag.
So the crucial point here is that this mathematical penalty resulted in nearly $1 trillion draining from the developing world in a single year. In 2024 alone, developing nations paid out $921 billion strictly in interest. Let that sink in. That's more than the entire gross domestic product of most African countries combined. Just gone. They aren't even paying down the principal amount they owe. They're literally just treading water trying to survive the interest. Let's jump to Section 3, the Farm Subsidy Scam, rigging the free market.
Okay, let's dive into another glaring contrast the explainer highlights: the sheer hypocrisy surrounding global agriculture. Rich countries consistently demand that poor nations open their markets and compete fairly, right? Yet at the exact same time, the U.S. is writing checks to its own farmers that completely dwarf the entire GDP of nations like Zambia. They told the developing world to eliminate their safety nets, while the U.S. government was projecting $42 billion in subsidy checks for its own agricultural sector. A cotton farmer in West Africa isn't losing because they're bad at farming. They're trying to compete against someone wrapped in a multi-billion-dollar safety net.
And the real kicker? These massive safety nets aren't just rescuing struggling small-time family farmers. In 2024, the average U.S. farm household income was over $150,000, which is actually 32% higher than the national average. Our sources point out that this heavily subsidizes massive corporate agriculture, artificially drives down global prices, and basically locks poor farmers out of the market entirely.
That takes us to Section 4, the Broken Climate Promise, the bribe that wasn't.
Let's shift our focus to how these institutions handle global crises, specifically looking at climate finance. The contrast here is just staggering. Back in 2009, rich nations promised $100 billion a year to help poor nations deal with climate change. Well, they delivered it 2 years late and mostly disguised as more loans. Meanwhile, in 2020, global fossil fuel subsidies hit an unbelievable $5.9 trillion. To put that into perspective, that is $11 million a minute subsidizing the very fuels they are demanding poor countries stop using.
It's incredibly frustrating because the poorest nations produce minimal emissions,
Yet they are the ones facing rising sea levels and devastating weather events. They're being asked to hit the brakes on their own economic growth for the global good in exchange for financial support that simply never shows up. As the president of the Marshall Islands so powerfully put it at the UN, promises don't reclaim land in atoll nations.
All right, Section 5. Rules for the not me. The enforcement hypocrisy.
So, it becomes undeniably clear that the rules are selectively enforced, especially when we look at the World Trade Organization. When the WTO actually started ruling against the United States, the U.S. simply bypassed accountability by dismantling the appellate court. They just blocked the appointment of new judges. Out of 11 recent violations, the U.S. appealed 9 of them into a court that literally no longer exists. Obviously, a developing country with limited trade leverage has absolutely no option to do something like that. The rules are strictly binding for the weak, but entirely optional for the strong.
This whole dynamic leads into what our sources call messy multilateralism. The Doha round of trade talks back in 2001 was supposed to make developing countries the priority, but it completely collapsed. Instead, rich nations pivoted to signing hundreds of bilateral, one-on-one, backroom trade deals. And why does that matter to us? Because in a massive multilateral forum, poor countries actually have strength in numbers. But in a one-on-one negotiation with a global superpower, they have zero leverage.
There's a really bitter historical irony here that the explainer points out. The United States built its massive 19th century industrial base safely behind huge tariff walls. Countries like South Korea and Germany rebuilt using heavy state subsidies and debt relief. But today, if a developing country tries those exact same strategies, they get slapped with sanctions by the WTO or cut off completely by the IMF. It's the economic equivalent of climbing a ladder to success and then completely pulling the ladder up so nobody else has a chance to follow.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 6, Architecture, not a conspiracy. The system working as designed. Okay, let's dive into the ultimate conclusion drawn by the source material. Despite 14 years of so-called preferential access schemes, the poorest countries have been kept precisely where they started. After over a decade of programs that were supposedly designed to help the poorest nations increase their trade footprint, their share of global exports moved from 1.0% to just 1.1%. So this system didn't fail. It produced a highly precise, measurable result that kept the poorest countries exactly where they already were.
Now, when you stack all this data together, it paints a picture, not of some secret, shadowy conspiracy, but of a highly visible building designed from the ground up to extract from the weak and protect the powerful. There are no supervillains sitting in a smoky back room plotting against the developing world. Honestly, it's much worse than that, because it's structural. A conspiracy can be exposed and shut down, but an institution stands long after its original designers are gone, quietly operating exactly as it was built to do.
As the explainer states, 3.4 billion people are paying the interest on a debt they didn't choose for a system they didn't design, enforced by rules they didn't write. So we leave you with this final thought to chew on. If the table was rigged before you even sat down, how do you ever expect to win the game? And more importantly, what would it actually take to build a completely new table? Thanks for joining us today.